This podcast is coming to you from Wongal and Gadigal country, also known as Balmain, where the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is located. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we share and agree that sovereignty was never ceded. Well, hello and welcome everyone to this episode of A JustER Generation. I'm today recording this on Ngunnawal, Ngambri country here in Canberra, and I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging from this country that is our nation's capital. We're thrilled to have a very special guest, good friend of the Edmund Rice Centre and former Minister for Indigenous Affairs, the Honourable Linda Burney MP. Linda is a proud member of the Wiradjuri Nation and was the first Aboriginal person elected to the New South Wales Parliament and the first Aboriginal woman in Australia's House of Representatives. She has dedicated over 30 years advocating for our nation's First Peoples and has held many key roles, most recently the Minister for Indigenous Australians, a former teacher and Director General of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. Linda's career as an educator in history combating family violence reflects her ongoing commitment to social justice. It's an absolute privilege to have you join us, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you.
Linda, for those unfamiliar with your story, what inspired you to step into activism? And can you share the key moments that have shaped your journey into advocacy and politics?
I think it probably started when I was a little girl. I always hated bullying. I disliked things that weren't fair. And I've always been like that. And I think that's where it really started. And of course, growing up with my great aunt and uncle, who were elderly people, they raised me with very old-fashioned values and always about how you treat each other. And you treat each other the way you want to be treated. And that was just the way that I was made.
So in terms of that, you had early years where you really were focused on a range of areas around First Nations empowerment, whether it was the land rights movement or other areas, including education. Maybe you could give us a bit of a sense of what journey took you there as a young person and what inspired you.
Well, I've always been an advocate for social justice, I suppose. I just didn't know how to explain it. And it just seemed natural to me. I couldn't conceive of a world that wasn't just. And I came to understand that things are not just in this country for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that was just a natural thing for me, is to say, well, you know, you can either complain about it and do nothing, or you can do something about it. And I chose to do something about it. And I think some seminal moments for me was particularly teaching out in Mount Druitt back in the late 70s, 80s, where I think there was one child in my class of 30 whose parents were together. Everyone else was living in single-parent households, lots of poverty. That was instrumental to me, and I got involved in an organisation called the New South Wales Aboriginal Education Consultative Group, the AECG, never knowing that I'd become its president, and that was about advocacy for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander children in particular. And that advocacy was political. There's no two ways about it. And but the fire, I think, was lit really blazingly in '88 with the so-called bicentennial of Australia, and I very much became an on the street activist then. And for me, becoming a mainstream politician was also about continuing that activism, but in a different way.
Mm. It really does sound like your background in education, particularly your experience as a teacher, influenced your approach to politics as well throughout your career. Is it something that shaped your thinking around actually these are the things that need to happen in this space to make a difference, or was it a broader view?
I think it was slightly broader than that. I think education is an incredibly powerful tool for good. I spoke to a group of teachers on Saturday, and I said that your role is service and social justice, and when you think about it, the thing that we all have in common in this country is that we all go to school. And therefore, the institutions of education have an incredibly powerful role in shaping society, but also shaping the individual, shaping
Mm,
the person. And that's a very, very serious and powerful position to be in.
mm. Wow. I mean, I can just think my father was an educator as well, as was my mother, and I can see their commitment, particularly to education in the Pacific at the tertiary level, what a difference that made, particularly in leadership and other areas. I'd like to now, if you don't mind, segue to the 2023 referendum.
Yes.
It was a bit of disappointment to many of our supporters and listeners. Many were not only committed to seeing a voice to Parliament and recognition of the place of Australia's First Peoples in the Constitution, but also a full realisation of the Uluru Statement of the Heart and its ask in its entirety, including voice, treaty, and truth.
Mhm.
With the benefit of hindsight and your previous roles, including as Minister for Indigenous Australians, how do you see the referendum through the longer view of history for recognition and rights
Mhm.
of Australia's First Nations? And perhaps what lessons or understandings can we as a country take from it, from that experience last year?
Well, firstly, it was a bitter, bitter disappointment, of course, and that is felt very deeply by many non-Aboriginal Australians and many Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders. And I remember how hard we all worked for that referendum. And when Peter Dutton walked away from it, and we realised it wasn't going to be bipartisan, it really made it doubly difficult, doubly difficult. And the negativity that came the way of people like me and you, uh, the abuse I've received because of our position was very, very damaging. But I have said this. I think that, I said it in my valedictory speech. I think that the arc of justice always bends,
Mm,
and that arc bent towards us, even though the referendum failed. What didn't fail is 6.5 million Australians said yes. That's not a failure. We have now an amazing emerging group of young First Nations leaders coming out of the referendum. And we know also that in communities where there were really high populations of Aboriginal people, Yarrabah, Nooka, Tiwi Islands, Yuendamu, places like that, the vote was 80 to 90% yes. And that says our people wanted it. So in my mind, they are silver linings, and I do think that history will judge the referendum, and the lessons we take out of it are more than we can anticipate now. But the other thing that you point out is really important, is that the Uluru Statement in its entirety was also about treaty, and it was also about truth-telling. And I think that as I move around post-referendum, that people are taking it on themselves to undertake truth-telling. Schools are doing amazing things. Community groups are doing wonderful things, and it really is something that's not gone away. And neither has the call for constitutional recognition. That won't go away. Just because the referendum said no, it doesn't mean it's no forever. And of course, the aspirations for treaty and truth are being pursued at a state and territory level as well. So, I'm heartbroken that we didn't get the voice, but I am encouraged by what I see.
I was quite interested in your point about that group of emerging leaders that came through and will be probably known as the referendum generation of leaders.
Yes.
Were there any positives of the process undertaking that can inform them, as well as those committed to allyship, in terms of supporting the continued journey to reconciliation, truth-telling, treaty, and voice? As you said, these are things that won't go away. They'll be important parts of now the way the story gets told in our nation's history.
I love your characterization of the generation of the referendum, because that's truly what these young people are. They realise that many Australians still don't know the truth. Many Australians don't know Aboriginal people, and many Australians don't care. They have been blooded, if I can use that term, by a bitter disappointment and a sense of rejection. But they are positive, they are beautiful, and they are stepping up all over this country. And they understand that sometimes justice is slow and truth is slow, but it will not move unless you move it.
I think that is so true and so much a part of that longer view of history. I think that, as you say, that arc of social justice, the arc of history bends towards social justice. And it is something that, has been one of those truths that we've seen over and over again, whether it's in the US, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Australia. These are part of the journey.
It certainly is. I was in Washington a few weeks ago, and I stood in the middle of the Martin Luther King memorial and read those words and saw where he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, and it was so moving.
Mm-hmm. I can't imagine. I haven't been there myself, but I agree. Just the fact that one person's words can make a difference to such a huge number of people, not just in the one country, but globally. I mean, people look to that. It is something that, again, shows how important leadership in this area is. Throughout your career, you've held both powerful political positions and remain committed to fighting for the rights of the community. This balance must have posed unique challenges. How have you navigated balancing your personal commitments to social justice with your role as a minister for the Crown, a position that some view as tied to the stripping of rights in some regards in terms of history? What advice would you offer to those who may feel at odds between their professional responsibilities and their passion for advocacy?
I never distinguish between them.
Right.
My passion for advocacy, whether it's women's rights, whether it's the rights of children, the rights of our people, human rights, has always driven me. I never distinguished between the two. And were there times where I found it compromising? Of course, but not terribly. One of the things that I did, particularly in the first decade of my political career, was not take on the portfolio of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. Why? The reason is that I didn't feel I was mature enough. I didn't feel like I was ready. And I believed that the time was not right in my growth as a First Nations person for me to take on that responsibility. When I finally did in 2016, I was respected enough in the community. I was known well enough. I believed I was mature enough, and I was ready for that responsibility. So it was combining my cultural responsibilities with the professional ones that you spoke about. The other thing is that, I made a point of doing other things in my career other than Aboriginal affairs because I wanted to show the broader community, don't put us in a box. I was a good Minister for Community Services. I was a good Minister for Volunteering. I was a good Minister for Youth. I was a good Minister for Women. I was a good Shadow Minister for Human Services. And the story writes itself, really.
Yeah, it is something that's actually quite interesting given the history of the separation of Indigenous affairs to the rest of Australia is just purely as a result of our history.
Yes.
But as you say, the Ministry for Indigenous Affairs is as much about Australia as it is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And it is something maybe that future ministers will have more of a sense of how you navigate the two rather than keeping them separate, perhaps.
One of the things that I am very proud of is that during my tenure as Minister for Aboriginal Australians, Indigenous Australians, I should say, we worked as a cabinet where every cabinet minister took on their responsibility. The education minister took on his responsibility in Aboriginal affairs, the environment minister, the communications minister, the arts minister. So our lives touch all of those places, and those people have responsibility in their portfolio for everyone, including First Australians.
Yeah, so it was always, when I worked up in the Kimberley, it was always a point of issue in terms of ensuring that those ministers responsible in other areas had responsibilities that they could clearly see and have a sense of obligation within the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Not only obligation, responsibility.
Absolutely. Linda, you've had a storied career as an educator, activist, bureaucrat, and politician, As you say, you've done so much over your career.
It's a bit exhausting, actually, right?
If you look at the next generation of First Nations emerging leaders, where do you feel the emphasis on social justice, activism, and leadership should be? The reason I ask this question is my sense is we've invested a lot in that emerging leadership, but in certain paths that have given opportunity to really build up skills in areas that have been seen as important, particularly in terms of organizational leadership and the like. I'm just aware also that there was a leadership that emerged in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that really was that organic leadership and something that was built on the perceived need for challenging the norms that were there, ensuring the rights agenda got on the front foot. And I just wondered whether you had any reflections on whether we have the balance right at the moment, or whether we need to lean in to investing in different styles of leadership.
I think we need to invest in different styles. I mean, the difference, one of the differences now is that we have more tertiary educated young people. And it's people like myself. My responsibility is to nurture that leadership, to encourage it. I don't know that always happens as well as it ought to. Of course, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, there are issues that have been around forever, and they will remain around for a long time. And that shapes what people focus on. But I want to see our young people represented in all aspects of life, and not necessarily because they're Aboriginal, but they might be an architect, they might be a musician, they might be a doctor that's doing wonderful things, they might be running non-government organisations. But it's about backing those young people in. And the other thing is that those young people need to understand, and I've got no doubt they will, that what is available now it hasn't happened by magic. It's been years and years and lifetimes of work, and they've got to appreciate that and realise that they are really resting on the shoulders of giants, which we've all done generationally. And eventually it'll be their shoulders that will be lent on by the next generation. So it's taking one's place, being supported, but also understanding that it's a very big responsibility.
Linda, you are one of those leaders who I feel is very understated in terms of your leadership, but you've done so much for the community, and I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
What does the future look like for you, Linda? Just as a quick sort of forecasting for the next few years, because I'm sure you're one of those people who will never stop.
I will never stop. I would love to do some mentoring. I would. I'm sure I'll do something in the education space. There's a number of people that think I should write a book, and I don't know that I'll do that. But I'm opening the door to the universe, and we'll see what walks through.
Oh, well, all the best with that future endeavour, which I'm sure we'll be asking you to come and do a couple of things with us, I'm sure, at the centre.
Very happy to.
Final question I ask for all our guests. If there were 3 things you would advise your younger self in lieu of what you know now, what would they be?
The first would be don't talk to fill the space. Listen. And when you've got something important to say it. My second would be to take care of yourself. There's only one body, and that body's got to last a long time. So I don't mean just physically taking care of yourself. I mean taking care of your heart as well, and your head. And the third thing I would say is that as human beings, we're all going to experience great moments of tragedy and sadness. But it's important in those moments that you take a lesson from it and make you a better person.
Well, I can't think of more wise advice than you've just given us. Linda, can I again thank you for doing this interview, but also for your service, not just to the community, but also to the people of Australia during a very difficult period, obviously, and one, as we mentioned, was disappointing for many. But as you say, there are some really important wins that came out of it, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So
Absolutely.
With that, thank you, and we'll finish the interview here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of A JustER Generation. It's through supporters like yourself that we keep our work going. You can support the work of the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education by making a donation through our website, www.erc.org.au. The Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is part of Edmund Rice Community Services. I'm Alopi Latukefu. Until next time, goodbye.